No income tax for anyone making less than $150,000. That's what Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick just said in a recent interview and indicated that that was Trump's ultimate goal. That's a big statement, and it would be life-changing for a lot of people. Let's watch what he said, and then I'll break it down.
I know what his goal is. No tax for anybody who makes less than $150,000 a year. That's his goal. And that's what I'm working for.
So how big of a tax cut are we actually talking about? If you're single with $150,000 in taxable income, in 2025, you'd fall in the 24% tax bracket. Now, all of your income isn't taxed at 24%, just the amount over $103,000. Overall, you'd pay roughly $29,000 in federal taxes, which ends up being about 19% of your income. Now, if you're married and your combined income is $150K, you get a little benefit and you'd be in the 22% tax bracket and pay approximately $23,000 in federal taxes, which ends up being about 15% of your income. Now, giving people a 15% pay raise would be an absolute game changer. But how much would this impact the country's tax revenue, which would be the big pushback on this? So for tax year 2022, which is the last IRS data we have for tax returns filed in 2023, but for 2022 tax year, there were 161.3 million tax returns filed. Of those, 123 million, or 76%, had taxable income under 100K. And then you had 149 million, or 92%, had taxable income under 200K. Now, the IRS doesn't publish data specifically for those making 150K or less. They only have the range from 100 to 200K. But from that, we can roughly estimate the number of people this would impact. By my estimates from this data, this would mean zero in taxes for about 136 million people, or 136 million returns filed. There's some married couples in there filing joint returns. That makes up about 85% of all tax returns. Now, what would that do to the country's income tax revenue? Well, in 2022, the US collected about $2.1 trillion in individual income tax revenue. Of that, approximately 22% was paid by those making under 150K. It ended up being about $476 billion. So those making under 150K, their taxes cover about 22% of total individual income tax revenue collected. The remaining 78% is paid by everybody making over 150K. So what would happen if that tax revenue of about $500 billion were to just go away? Well, the idea here would be to replace it with tariffs. Lutnick is a huge proponent of tariffs. We know Trump is as well. Now, while Lutnick doesn't directly set tariffs, he's very involved in investigating, enforcing, recommending trade measures, which tariffs are a big part of that. Trump has talked about replacing the individual income tax revenue with tariffs in his campaign, and I've previously talked about why that wouldn't work. Based on recent import data, you need to apply a tariff of over 50% to completely replace the individual income tax revenue, which is about $2 to $2.5 trillion. But you may be able to replace income tax revenue of those making under 150K, which again was about $500 billion in revenue in 2022. Big maybe there. In 2024, the US imported goods were about 3.3 trillion. Now that excludes services, that's just good imports. To completely replace the income tax revenue from those making under 150K, you'd only need to place a 15% tariff on all imports, which is much more reasonable than a 50 to 60% tariff. Now, if you're just trying to replace the income tax revenue of those people, of those making less than 150K, it may be doable. But of course, then there's the question of who ultimately pays the tariff. Those people may end up paying higher prices. Corporations could raise their prices. If companies bring back manufacturing here, that would provide more jobs, but less tariff revenue. And then we don't know how, other countries are necessarily going to react, as we've seen now. It's very unpredictable, and that's why we're seeing volatility in the stock market. But let me just say that as nice as it would be for 85% of the country, I would not count on this. I think Trump is already going to have a very difficult time extending the current tax rates. So these are the tax rates today, and these are what they will go back to if the rates are not extended. Simply extending these rates another 10 years is expected to cost between $3.9 and $4.8 trillion. If you eliminate taxes completely for those making less than 150K, that's another $500 billion per year in revenue for the next 10 years, at least. So I don't think it's possible when the deficit is already running at $2 trillion per year. I personally don't think this was meant to be a serious tax proposal. I know X was kind of blowing up about this proposal. I don't think it's meant to be taken seriously, or I don't think he meant it literally. In a less literal sense, a lot of Trump's proposals, like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security, the majority of those proposals would impact people under 150K. But setting the first bracket at 0% up to 150K, I think it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. So hate to say, I would not get your hopes up on this one. I think it was just something said off the cuff and not meant to be an official tax proposal.